Emily was not the kind of girl who had ever been handed an easy life. From the outside, she looked like any other young woman working long hours at a restaurant. But if you looked closer, you could see the tiredness in her eyes and the quiet determination in the way she carried herself. Every morning before the sun rose, she would leave her small apartment, kiss her sick mother goodbye, and head out to the restaurant where she worked as a waitress. Her life was a cycle of endless shifts, bills that never seemed to stop coming, and dreams that always felt just out of reach. But there was one thing about Emily that set her apart from the others. She had a voice, not just an ordinary voice that sang along to radio tunes, but a voice filled with warmth, strength, and a beauty that could make people stop in their tracks. As a child, she had loved singing more than anything. She would sing at school talent shows, at church gatherings, and even while walking home from school. Her mother always encouraged her, telling her that her gift was something special, something worth protecting. Life, however, has a way of throwing obstacles in the path of even the brightest talents. Emily's father had passed away when she was only 14. Her mother, left to raise her alone, worked tirelessly until illness struck. A lingering sickness had kept her mother in bed for years, making it impossible for her to work. Emily had no choice but to step in. She took the first job she could find, waiting tables at a busy restaurant, and over time, it became her routine, her duty, and her survival. Even so, Emily never let her love for singing die. It was her comfort, her secret escape from the harshness of reality. She would hum quietly while polishing glasses, sing softly to herself while wiping down tables, and sometimes, when she thought no one was listening, she would let her voice rise in the kitchen while she stacked plates. The other waitresses teased her gently, saying she should audition for a talent show or sing at the bar when the live band came, but Emily only laughed it off. Deep down, she was afraid of failing, of being laughed at, or worse, of being told she wasn't good enough. The restaurant where she worked wasn't an ordinary place. It was one of those upscale spots in the city where rich businessmen, celebrities, and powerful people came to dine. Every night, the chandeliers sparkled, the glasses clinked, and expensive suits and dresses filled the room. Emily often felt invisible among them, just another servant carrying trays of food and drinks. She saw the world of wealth and glamour from the sidelines, knowing it was a world she could never belong to. Sometimes she wondered what it would feel like to stand on the other side of that life, to be noticed, admired, and respected. Despite the challenges, she carried herself with quiet grace. Customers often complimented her for her politeness and the warmth in her smile. Her co-workers admired her strength, though she never boasted about it. What many people didn't know was that Emily was constantly worried about her mother's health. After long shifts, she would hurry home, cook meals, and sit by her mother's bedside, singing to her softly until she fell asleep. In those moments, singing wasn't about dreams or fame. It was about love, about giving her mother comfort when she needed it most. There were nights when Emily herself would cry silently in bed. She wanted so badly to chase her dream of singing, to stand on a stage and share her gift with the world. But how could she? She barely had enough money to keep the lights on. Taking risks wasn't a luxury she could afford. Every day was about survival, and survival left little space for dreams. Still, in the quiet of her heart, she held on to the belief that maybe, just maybe, one day she would be heard. At the restaurant, the sound of live music was a regular part of the evening. A small band often played soft jazz or romantic ballads to create the perfect atmosphere for the wealthy guests. Emily admired them from a distance. She watched the singers with longing, imagining what it might feel like to hold a microphone, to sing under the warm glow of the lights, and to see people turn their heads in awe. Sometimes, when she carried trays past the stage, she felt a pang of envy mixed with admiration, but she never dared to step closer. That was their world, not hers. To the guests, Emily was just another waitress. They didn't know the battles she fought every day, the responsibilities she carried on her young shoulders, or the gift she kept hidden. They saw only the uniform, the polite smile, the girl who brought their food and disappeared quietly. What they didn't see was the fire inside her. a fire that had not yet found its chance to burn bright. Emily's story, up to this point, was one of quiet endurance. She worked, she sacrificed, and she dreamed in silence. Yet, life has a strange way of testing those who carry unspoken dreams. While she had no idea of it yet, a moment was coming soon. A single, unexpected chance that would change everything. And in that moment, the world would finally hear the voice she had kept hidden for so long. The restaurant was always busy in the evenings, but on certain nights it felt different, as if the air itself carried more weight. That was usually when someone important walked in, a celebrity, a politician, or one of the city's wealthy business magnates. On this particular night, the atmosphere shifted the moment Richard Hale arrived. Richard was not just another rich man. He was a billionaire, a man whose name was printed on magazine covers and business articles. People spoke about him in whispers, sometimes with admiration and sometimes with envy. Richard was known for his sharp business mind, but he was also infamous for his arrogance. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from knowing he had more money than most people could ever dream of. Wherever he went, people moved aside for him. Waiters rushed to serve him, managers came out personally to greet him, and even the live band seemed to play a little louder when he entered, as if to impress him. He loved this attention. For Richard, being admired and feared was as natural as breathing. That evening, Richard entered the restaurant dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Emily earned in 6 months. His shoes were polished, his watch glimmered under the lights, and his smile was one of self-satisfaction. He was not alone. A group of high-profile business partners and investors followed him, men and women who were powerful in their own right but seemed smaller in his presence. They laughed at his jokes, nodded at his opinions, and treated him like the most important man in the room. Emily noticed them the moment they stepped in. She had seen Richard before. He often came to the restaurant when he wanted to impress clients or celebrate a deal. Each time, he took the best table, ordered the most expensive wine, and made sure everyone around him knew that he was a man of wealth and influence. Emily couldn't deny that his presence was commanding, but she also knew he had a sharp tongue. More than once she had overheard him mocking staff members, making jokes at the expense of waiters, or belittling the singers on stage if they didn't meet his high standards. That night, the restaurant manager nearly tripped over himself trying to welcome Richard and his party. They were given the largest round table near the stage with the best view of the band. Emily was one of the waitresses assigned to serve them, and though she tried to stay calm, she felt a knot form in her stomach. Rich clients were always demanding, but Richard was in a league of his own. The evening began as expected. Richard ordered an extravagant spread of food and drinks, speaking loudly so that everyone around could hear. He liked being noticed. Every so often, he raised his glass and made remarks about business or life, his companions laughing obediently. Emily moved quickly around the table, refilling glasses, bringing dishes, and trying to stay invisible. She hoped to get through the shift without drawing his attention. But Richard had a way of noticing people, not out of kindness but out of curiosity and control. He liked to test people, especially those he thought were beneath him. When Emily brought over a tray of champagne, he gave her a quick glance, the kind that measured someone and dismissed them within seconds. To him, she was just a waitress, another servant in a world built for his comfort. The band played softly in the background, their music adding elegance to the room. Richard occasionally commented on the singer, sometimes praising, sometimes criticizing. At one point, he leaned back in his chair and laughed about how easy it must be to stand on stage and sing for money, as if it required no real talent compared to the empire he had built. His companions laughed with him, even if some didn't agree. That was the power Richard held. People laughed when he laughed, even at things that weren't funny. For Emily, working near his table was a constant exercise in self-control. She heard his comments, the mocking tone in his voice, the arrogance in his laughter, and though she didn't show it, it made her uneasy. She hated the way people like him looked at waitresses as if they were invisible, as if they had no story, no dreams, no worth beyond carrying plates. To him, she was not a young woman with a sick mother at home and a gift for singing. She was just another nameless server in a uniform. And yet, fate has a way of setting the stage for unexpected turns. Richard, with all his wealth and power, had no idea that the quiet waitress moving around his table carried something that could shake even his arrogance. He had mocked many people before, dismissed countless voices, and silenced those who dared to stand against him. Tonight, he would be the one silenced, not by money, not by power, but by the very voice he thought unworthy of notice. For now, though Richard enjoyed his evening, laughing loudly with his guests, sipping his wine, and glancing at the band as if he owned the place, Emily kept moving quietly, careful not to spill a drink or stumble, all the while wishing she could finish her shift without attracting his attention. She didn't yet know that the night had already chosen a different path for her. A single spark, a careless mocking comment, was about to push her from the shadows of the dining hall straight into the spotlight, where her hidden gift would finally be revealed. The evening was moving along as usual. Plates clattered softly, glasses chimed, and the band's music floated through the restaurant like a gentle wave. The guests at Richard's table were deep in conversation, their voices rising with laughter every time the billionaire made one of his sharp remarks. Emily moved quietly among them, carrying trays, setting down dishes, and clearing empty glasses. She had perfected the art of being unnoticed, of blending into the background. The last thing she wanted was attention, especially from Richard. But fate rarely asks what we want. As she passed near the stage, Emily found herself softly humming to the tune the band was playing. It was a habit she couldn't control. Music had always been her comfort, and even when she was busy working, a song on her lips made the night feel lighter. She thought no one noticed. To her surprise, one of the waiters smiled at her, having caught the sound of her voice. But someone else noticed too, and not in the kind way. Richard had leaned back in his chair, a glass of wine in his hand, when he heard Emily's soft humming. At first, he simply raised an eyebrow, amused that a waitress dared to sing within earshot. But then, his amusement turned into a smirk. In his world, singing was something to be judged, mocked, or bought with money, not something to be freely enjoyed by a server carrying plates. He let out a laugh, loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, pointing casually in Emily's direction. "Even the waitress thinks she's ready for the stage. Maybe she believes she's the next superstar." His voice carried easily across the room, sharp and filled with mockery. The people at his table chuckled, some politely, others nervously, because they didn't want to be the only ones not laughing at his joke. Emily froze, her face turning warm with embarrassment. The tray in her hands suddenly felt heavier. She hadn't meant for anyone to hear her humming. She wasn't trying to show off, but now all eyes at the table were on her. The laughter stung like a slap. Richard wasn't finished. "Come now," he added with a smirk. "If you're going to sing, do it properly. Maybe the band needs a new backup singer." The words, though delivered like a joke, carried a cruel edge. He wasn't really inviting her to sing. He was putting her down, making her into entertainment for his amusement. His companions laughed louder this time, emboldened by his arrogance. For Emily, it felt like the floor had dropped beneath her. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into the kitchen and never come back out. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. Being laughed at by strangers was one thing, but being mocked by someone like Richard, in front of so many people, felt unbearable. She lowered her gaze, trying to hide her flushed cheeks, and muttered a quick apology as if she had done something wrong. But not everyone in the room saw it the way Richard did. The band's singer, a kind older woman who had watched Emily working in the restaurant for years, noticed the humiliation in the young waitress's eyes. She had often heard Emily humming around the tables, and she always suspected there was something special in her voice. Now, seeing her being mocked, the singer's heart ached. She decided to do something bold. As the band finished their current song, the singer glanced at Emily and smiled reassuringly. Then, without warning, she held out the microphone toward her. "Why don't you show us what you've got, sweetheart?" she said warmly. Her tone wasn't mocking, it was supportive, protective even. The room stirred with curiosity. Conversations hushed, glasses paused midair, and suddenly all eyes shifted toward the young waitress standing awkwardly with a tray in her hands. Richard chuckled again, thinking this was even better entertainment. "Yes, yes, let her sing," he said loudly, clapping his hands together as if this were some private game he had started. His companions laughed with him, waiting to see the embarrassment unfold. Emily's heart thudded painfully. She felt trapped between two impossible choices. If she refused, she would look weak and confirm the billionaire's insult. If she accepted, she risked making a fool of herself in front of the entire restaurant. Her palms were sweaty, her legs shaky. She wanted to run, but the kindness in the band singer's eyes gave her a strange kind of courage. Slowly, she set the tray down on a nearby table and took a hesitant step forward. The room seemed to hold its breath as she reached out and touched the microphone. Her fingers trembled. For a moment, she thought she might faint. Richard leaned back with a smug smile, ready to enjoy her failure. He imagined she would stammer, sing off-key, or break under pressure, and he would have the satisfaction of mocking her again. But Emily, though filled with fear, also felt something else stir inside her. She remembered the nights she had sung to her mother at home, how her voice had calmed her mother's pain, how music had always been her safe place. She remembered her childhood dream of standing on a stage, and though this wasn't a grand stage, it was a chance, maybe the only one she would ever have. The microphone felt heavy in her hand, and the silence in the restaurant pressed down on her. Everyone was watching. The laughter from a moment ago still echoed in her ears, but so did her mother's voice. "Your voice is your gift. Don't hide it." Emily took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't back away now. This was the moment that would either break her or set her free. The restaurant had gone silent in a way Emily had never experienced before. Normally, there was always background noise. Clinking glasses, quiet conversations, footsteps across the polished floor. But now all of that had faded away. Every pair of eyes in the room seemed to be fixed on her, the young waitress who had been unexpectedly handed a microphone. Emily's fingers curled tightly around the mic. Her knees felt weak, and for a moment she thought she might drop it. This wasn't how she imagined singing in front of people. If she had ever pictured her first performance, it was on a stage with people who wanted to listen, not in a restaurant full of strangers waiting to laugh at her. She glanced quickly toward Richard's table. The billionaire leaned back comfortably, his smirk wider than ever. To him, this was entertainment. He thought he had cornered her into an impossible situation, and he was eager to watch her stumble. His companions leaned in, whispering among themselves, some amused, some curious. They were ready to see a waitress make a fool of herself. But then Emily's eyes met the band singer's. The older woman gave her an encouraging nod, a look that said, "You can do this. Don't be afraid." That single gesture gave Emily the smallest spark of courage. For once, someone wasn't laughing at her. Someone believed she had a chance. Still, the weight of the moment pressed down hard. Emily thought about putting the microphone back into the singer's hand and walking away. She could shake her head, apologize, and return to her job, pretending none of this had happened. But deep inside, she knew she would regret it forever. She had spent her whole life hiding her gift, keeping her voice tucked away because she feared judgment. And now, in the most unexpected way, life was giving her a chance to either step forward or stay invisible. Her heart pounded as she stood there. She remembered her mother's frail voice whispering encouragement back at home. "Emily, your voice is your gift. Don't bury it just because the world can be cruel." Those words rang louder than the mocking laughter in her memory. One of Richard's companions chuckled and said, "Go on, girl. Let's hear it," his tone dripping with sarcasm. Another added, "This should be interesting." Their words only added to the tension, but Emily forced herself to take a slow, steady breath. The band leader, sensing her hesitation, leaned closer and whispered so only she could hear, "Start small. Sing what you love. Don't think about them. Think about the song." His calm tone soothed her nerves slightly. She nodded, though her throat felt dry. As she lifted the microphone closer to her lips, the entire room leaned in. Even the waiters paused in their steps, holding trays midair. The pianist's fingers hovered over the keys, waiting for her cue. For the first time, Emily wasn't just a waitress carrying plates. She was the center of attention. Richard chuckled again, shaking his head. "She won't do it," he muttered loud enough for others to hear. "She'll choke." His words were meant to crush her spirit, to remind everyone that he was in control of the moment. But strangely, hearing his voice gave Emily strength. She realized something important. If she walked away now, Richard would win. He would always remember her as the waitress who was too afraid to sing, and she would always remember herself that way too. That thought was unbearable. Her hands still trembled, but Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment. In her mind, she wasn't in a restaurant anymore. She was at home, sitting on the edge of her mother's bed, singing softly to ease her pain. She was back in the days of her childhood, when music made her feel alive, when her dreams still felt possible. She held onto those memories like a lifeline. When she opened her eyes again, something had shifted inside her. She no longer cared about the mocking billionaire, the expensive suits, or the chandeliers glittering above her. All that mattered was the song in her heart. The band began to play a gentle melody, soft and inviting, giving her a chance to find her footing. The first notes felt terrifying, like stepping onto a fragile bridge that might collapse beneath her. She hesitated, her voice caught in her throat, but then, slowly, she let out a single line. It was quiet, trembling, almost uncertain, but it was hers. The room listened. She sang another line, and her voice grew a little stronger. Though still shaky, it carried a sweetness, a sincerity that touched the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. The whispers at Richard's table faded. The smirks softened. People leaned forward, realizing this wasn't going to be the embarrassing spectacle they had expected. Richard's smile faltered ever so slightly. He still wore a mask of arrogance, but inside, he felt a flicker of surprise. The waitress had a voice. Not polished, not powerful yet, but something raw and real. Something that demanded attention. Emily, meanwhile, felt the shift. With every word she sang, her confidence grew. The trembling in her hands eased, and her fear began to melt away. She wasn't just surviving the challenge anymore. She was rising to meet it. The song was no longer a burden but a release, a way to show the world and herself who she truly was. The silence of the restaurant deepened, not with mockery this time, but with awe. The challenge had begun as a cruel joke, a test meant to humiliate her. But Emily was turning it into something else. She was proving that even the smallest voice, when given a chance, could silence a room full of doubters. And though she hadn't yet reached the height of her performance, the very act of standing there, microphone in hand, singing against laughter and fear, was already a victory in itself. Emily's heart was beating so fast that she could almost hear it echoing in her chest. The microphone felt heavy in her hands, as if it carried the weight of every fear and doubt she had ever held inside. She tried to steady her breathing, but her chest rose and fell too quickly. The restaurant, filled with glittering chandeliers and polished tables, suddenly felt like a stage, but not the kind she had dreamed of. This was not a welcoming stage. It was one filled with judgmental eyes, waiting for her to trip. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Panic swept over her like a cold wave. What if Richard was right? What if she really wasn't good enough? What if her voice cracked and the whole room laughed? She could already imagine the smirks, the whispers, the cruel laughter. The thought made her stomach twist. Richard leaned back in his chair, still wearing his confident grin. He nudged the man beside him and whispered something that made his table chuckle quietly. Emily caught the movement from the corner of her eye, and her fear deepened. This was exactly what he wanted, to see her crumble, to prove she was nothing more than a foolish waitress trying to play at being a singer. But then, in that heavy silence, she remembered something. She saw her mother's face in her mind, pale but smiling as she lay in bed, listening to Emily sing at night. She remembered her mother whispering, "Your voice is your gift, Emily. Don't hide it from the world. That memory struck her like a spark in the darkness. She wasn't singing for the billionaire or the crowd. She wasn't singing to prove anything to strangers. She was singing because it was who she was, because it was the one thing in her life that had always been hers. With that thought, she finally let out the first note. It was soft, trembling, almost like a whisper carried by the music. Her voice wavered with nervousness, but it was there, fragile and real. A few people in the crowd leaned closer, straining to hear. Richard smirked, ready to dismiss her, but the faint sweetness in her tone stopped him from laughing outright. The band, sensing her hesitation, kept the music gentle, giving her room to find her footing. The pianist's notes were soft, steady, like a guiding hand leading her forward. She sang another line, her voice still shaky but a little stronger than the first. Each note seemed to peel away a layer of fear. Emily focused on the song, on the melody she loved, instead of the audience. She thought of the nights when she sang alone in her tiny kitchen while cooking, or the mornings when she hummed as she walked to work. She poured those private moments into her voice, trying to forget the stares around her. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the microphone, but her voice began to steady. The words flowed more smoothly now, carrying a quiet strength. It wasn't yet the powerful performance that would silence the room completely, but it was enough to make people pause. Conversations stopped. Forks and knives clinked no more. The laughter that had filled the space minutes ago had vanished. For Richard, this wasn't what he expected. He had been certain she would break down or sing so badly that everyone would laugh. But as he watched her, something unsettled him. She wasn't perfect, not yet, but there was something honest in her voice that couldn't be ignored. He frowned slightly, unwilling to admit he felt even a hint of admiration. Emily, lost in the song, didn't see his expression. She only felt the shift in the room. The silence no longer felt hostile. It was changing into something else. People weren't waiting for her to fail anymore. They were waiting to hear what would come next. Her heart still pounded. Her palms still sweated. But her courage grew with every line. She realized she was still standing, still singing, and the world hadn't collapsed. The humiliation she had feared hadn't come. Instead, there was only the song and her voice moving through it. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself sink deeper into the music. Without the pressure of all those eyes on her, she could feel the words more clearly. The trembling in her voice began to fade, replaced with emotion. She wasn't just singing notes. She was telling a story, her story, of fear, of hope, of holding on to dreams even when life tried to bury them. The audience began to feel it too. One couple near the front exchanged surprised glances, nodding softly as if they understood that this wasn't an ordinary moment. A waiter who had paused mid-step let out a small smile. Even the band members, seasoned musicians who had seen countless singers come and go, looked at her with respect. And yet, Emily herself didn't notice any of that. She was too focused on surviving each line, on keeping her voice steady, on holding back the tide of fear that threatened to return. Every note was a battle against her own doubt, against the memory of laughter, against the thought of failure. It was still a trembling start. Her voice wasn't soaring yet, but it was building. She was climbing a fragile hill, step by step, unsure if she would reach the top. But with every shaky note, she was proving something important, not just to the crowd, but to herself. She could do this. She could face her fear. She could stand in the spotlight, even if her hands shook and her knees trembled. By the time she reached the end of the first verse, the room was no longer waiting for her to collapse. They were waiting for her to rise. The billionaire who had mocked her leaned forward, his arrogant smirk fading ever so slightly, though he still hid it behind a glass of wine. He wouldn't admit it yet, but even he felt the shift in the air. Emily, meanwhile, drew a deeper breath. She was trembling, yes, but she was still standing, still singing. And as she moved into the next part of the song, something inside her began to unlock, as though the fear was slowly giving way to the true power of her voice. The moment Emily moved into the next part of the song, something shifted inside her. The trembling that had shaken her voice began to fade. Her breathing grew steadier, her chest rising and falling in rhythm with the melody. For the first time since she stepped onto that little stage, she felt as though the music wasn't pulling her. It was carrying her. Her voice grew stronger, richer, more confident. The notes that had wavered moments ago now stretched into the air, clear and powerful, filling every corner of the room. She no longer sounded like a frightened waitress being mocked into singing. She sounded like someone who belonged on that stage. The audience noticed the change instantly. The polite curiosity in their faces turned into something else. Amazement. People who had been ready to laugh or dismiss her now leaned forward in their chairs, completely captured by her voice. Forks were placed quietly back on plates. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and the air in the restaurant seemed to thicken with focus. Emily sang with her eyes closed, pouring her emotions into every line. She wasn't singing for applause, not anymore. She was singing for the girl inside her who had once dreamed of stages and bright lights, for her mother who had believed in her when no one else did, and for the voice that had always lived inside her heart. When she opened her eyes again, she saw the room in a different light. The chandeliers sparkled, the tables gleamed, but all of it faded into the background. What mattered were the faces, hundreds of them, watching her in stunned silence. Their eyes followed her every movement, every breath, every note. It was as if the world outside had paused, leaving only her voice and their listening hearts. Even Richard, the billionaire who had mocked her, could no longer hide his surprise. His smug smile was gone, replaced by a tightened jaw and narrowed eyes. He wanted to keep laughing, to keep dismissing her, but the truth was undeniable. She had something he hadn't expected, real talent. The kind that couldn't be bought with money or crushed with insults. Emily's voice soared higher, steady and strong, rising like a bird breaking free from a cage. Each word carried emotion, longing, hope, pain, and strength. The audience felt it deep in their chests. Some shifted in their seats, uncomfortable not because the performance was bad, but because it touched a place in them they didn't want to expose. A man near the back lowered his glass of wine slowly, his eyes fixed on her. A woman in the front row blinked back tears, clutching her partner's hand. Even the waiters, who had been rushing between tables with plates and drinks, stopped for just a moment to watch, their trays balanced in midair. The room, once full of clinking glasses and cheerful noise, had transformed into a sanctuary of silence. Every ear was tuned to her voice, every heart beating in time with her song. It was no longer just a performance. It was a confession, a story woven into melody. Emily could feel the energy of the room feeding back into her. With each line she sang, she grew stronger, bolder. She stepped forward, no longer hiding behind fear. The microphone no longer felt heavy, it felt like an extension of her soul. She remembered the billionaire's laughter, the sting of humiliation she had felt only minutes ago. Instead of crushing her, that memory fueled her now. She was proving him wrong, not with anger, but with beauty. Every note was her answer to his mockery. Every verse a reminder that true worth could not be measured by money or status. By the time she reached the chorus, her voice had filled the entire restaurant, echoing against the walls. People who had never seen her before, who didn't even know her name, now felt as if they did. She wasn't just Emily the waitress anymore. She was Emily the singer, Emily the dreamer, Emily the fighter who dared to stand tall when she could have bowed her head. And then, as the music swelled, she hit a note so pure and strong that it seemed to freeze time. The sound rang out, clear as glass, and the silence around her deepened even more. No one dared to move. No one even breathed too loudly. It was as though the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the magic of that moment to pass before they allowed themselves to exhale. Emily's eyes glistened, not with fear anymore, but with power. She felt free. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of being seen. She wanted them to see her, to hear her, to know her heart. The song carried on, but it was no longer a struggle. It flowed out of her naturally, effortlessly, as if the music had always been waiting inside her, just needing a chance to be heard. When the final notes approached, she slowed, softening her voice, letting it fall gently like the closing of a beautiful story. The last sound lingered in the air like a whisper, delicate and unforgettable. Then absolute stillness. For a moment no one moved. The silence was so deep that Emily could hear her own breathing, could feel her heart pounding in her chest. For the briefest second, she wondered if they hadn't liked it, if maybe they were still holding back their laughter. But then it came, a sound that grew louder and louder until it filled the room again. Applause. First soft, then stronger, then thunderous. The entire restaurant erupted in claps and cheers, people rising from their seats, some even whistling and shouting her name. The sound shook her to her core. Emily's lips parted in shock. She had expected humiliation, maybe even pity. She had never expected this. Adoration, respect, awe. She had silenced the room, and now that silence had turned into the loudest applause she had ever heard in her life. In that moment, Emily realized she had done more than sing a song. She had taken back her dignity, her courage, her voice. She had turned the cruel laughter of a billionaire into the applause of a crowd. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Richard, the billionaire who had laughed the loudest, sat frozen in his chair. Only minutes earlier, he had been smirking with pride, certain that his mocking words would crush the young waitress. He had expected her to shrink away, to blush and stammer, to prove him right, that people like her had no place in his world of wealth and power. But now he was staring at her with eyes wide and unblinking, caught in the spell of a voice he could not deny. His glass of wine remained untouched in front of him. His hand, once tapping the table with arrogant rhythm, now rested stiffly at his side. The laughter that had rolled so easily from his mouth earlier was gone, swallowed by the silence of awe. For the first time in years, Richard felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: humility. As Emily's song faded and the applause erupted, he did not join in immediately. He sat there, locked in his own thoughts, replaying the sound of her voice in his mind. It wasn't just the beauty of it that struck him. It was the courage. She had dared to stand in front of a man like him. A man used to crushing people with words, and she had answered him without insult, without bitterness, but with a gift so powerful it made his mockery feel small. Around him, his business partners clapped loudly, some even standing. They were men who usually followed his lead, but tonight they were moved by something greater than wealth. One of them leaned toward Richard and whispered, "Remarkable, isn't she?" Richard gave no answer. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on Emily as she stood on the stage, her face glowing with both shock and relief. For a brief moment, Richard felt something he could not put into words. It was as though he had been exposed. His arrogance, his careless cruelty, his belief that money gave him the right to belittle others, all of it had been stripped away in front of an entire room. He had been the loudest voice mocking her, and now he was the quietest one, silenced not by force, but by truth. He thought back to his own childhood, to the times he had been told he was not good enough. He remembered the sting of laughter from boys richer than him, who mocked his shabby clothes and small dreams. He had buried those memories long ago, hiding them beneath layers of money, power, and pride. But tonight, a waitress's song had dug them back up, forcing him to face the boy he once was. The boy who had once dreamed, just as she dreamed now. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks as though straightening them could fix the unease he felt inside. For years he had believed respect came from fear, from dominance, from showing others how much more he had. But Emily had shown him something different. Respect could also come from honesty, from talent, from bravery. The applause continued, and Richard finally lifted his hands, clapping slowly. It was not his usual condescending clap, the kind he used when pretending to admire something beneath him. This time it was real, though still restrained. His eyes stayed locked on Emily, studying her as though she were a puzzle he could not solve. Emily noticed him too. Their eyes met briefly across the room. In that instant, she saw no arrogance in his gaze, no smirk on his lips. Instead, she saw a man caught off guard, a man who for once had nothing clever to say. She felt no need to gloat, no need to remind him of his earlier insult. Her song had been enough. Richard felt the sting of shame, but also something else, admiration. He could not deny it. He had tried to reduce her to nothing, and yet she had risen higher than anyone in the room. She had done what he thought impossible. She had silenced him, and in that silence, he found himself wondering if perhaps he had been wrong all along. His business partners whispered among themselves, some already imagining ways to profit from the waitress's talent. Richard heard them, but for once money did not seem to matter. What mattered was the raw honesty he had just witnessed. He was a man who lived in a world of deals and transactions, where everything had a price. But as he listened to the echo of Emily's song in his memory, he realized this was something priceless. As the clapping slowly faded and people returned to their meals, Richard remained thoughtful. He glanced at Emily one last time before turning back to his table. His pride told him to brush it off, to pretend it was nothing. But another voice inside whispered a truth he could not ignore. She had won, and he had been changed. The billionaire who once believed the world revolved around him now sat humbled, not by another wealthy man, not by power or influence, but by a waitress with a microphone and a voice that had reached places his money never could. In that moment, Richard was silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because words were too small for what he felt. He had entered the restaurant as the loudest man in the room. He now sat as the quietest, forced to carry the weight of his own arrogance and the unexpected gift of being humbled by a girl who refused to stay invisible. And deep inside, though he would never admit it out loud, he knew he would remember her song for the rest of his life. For a moment after Emily's final note drifted into silence, the entire restaurant seemed frozen. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, louder than the chatter and clinking glasses that had filled the room before. The air was heavy, as if everyone was afraid to break the fragile magic her voice had created. She stood there gripping the microphone, her chest rising and falling, her hands still trembling though her face carried a quiet glow. Then, somewhere in the crowd, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was soft at first, almost uncertain. But then another joined, and another, until the sound grew into a wave. The silence broke, and the room erupted into applause so powerful it seemed to shake the very walls. Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood to their feet, rising one by one until nearly the whole restaurant was on their feet, cheering for the girl who had dared to sing. Emily's eyes widened. She had expected laughter, maybe even pity, but never this, never a standing ovation. Her throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes, but this time it was not from humiliation. It was from joy, pure and overwhelming, a joy she had not felt in years. The band on stage smiled proudly, nodding at her as if she had always been one of them. The lead singer gave her a small bow, acknowledging that tonight, she had stolen the spotlight. The waiters and waitresses, her fellow workers, clapped the hardest of all. They knew her struggles, knew the long hours she worked to keep her mother alive, and seeing her shine now filled them with pride. Some customers whistled, others shouted, "Encore!" and "Bravo!" A woman in the front row dabbed her eyes with a napkin, while a man in a suit raised his glass toward her in respect. It didn't matter anymore that she was just a waitress in a place where people came to spend money. For that moment, she was more than that. She was the heart of the entire room. Emily lowered the microphone slowly, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. What could she say? Thank you? That felt too small. Instead, she bowed her head slightly, a shy gesture, and placed a hand over her chest as if to say, "This is from me to you." Richard, the billionaire who had mocked her, finally joined the applause. His claps were slower, more deliberate, but there was no denying their sincerity. His eyes had lost their arrogance. They carried something new, something softer. He, too, had risen from his chair, though he seemed almost reluctant to admit it to himself. Still, he stood among the crowd, giving her the respect she had more than earned. Emily caught sight of him briefly, and for the first time, she did not feel small in his presence. She did not feel like the powerless waitress he had laughed at earlier. Instead, she felt equal, maybe even stronger. Her song had reached him, pierced the armor of wealth and pride he carried around himself. She didn't need to win his approval anymore because she already had the approval of something greater, the people who truly listened. The applause went on, refusing to die down. Some people even started chanting her name. Emily! Emily! She had never imagined strangers would ever say her name like that, with admiration instead of indifference. Her hands shook as she lifted them slightly in gratitude. Her cheeks flushed red from the attention. It wasn't just applause she was hearing. It was validation. All the nights she had sung quietly to herself. All the dreams she had tucked away because life had been too hard. All the humiliations she had endured. They suddenly felt worth it. Every tear, every sacrifice, every long shift had led to this moment. As the clapping slowly began to settle, a man from the back called out, "Sing again!" Others joined in agreement. The band smiled and gestured for her to stay, but Emily only shook her head gently, not out of fear, but because she wanted this moment to remain perfect. She knew that sometimes one song was enough to change everything. She stepped down from the small stage carefully, still feeling the rush of adrenaline in her veins. People reached out to her as she passed, patting her on the shoulder, congratulating her, praising her bravery. Strangers she had never spoken to told her she had a gift, told her not to waste it, told her she belonged somewhere greater than this restaurant. Their words lifted her higher than she had ever been. When she finally returned to her corner of the restaurant, where her tray and notepad still lay waiting, her fellow workers gathered around her. They hugged her, some with tears in their eyes, and one of them whispered, "You showed them who you really are." For Emily, that meant more than any applause. Richard watched from his table, his face unreadable but his eyes thoughtful. He had the power to offer her opportunities, to open doors she could never imagine. Yet in that moment he realized she didn't need him. She had already proven she could create her own path. He raised his glass slightly in her direction, a silent acknowledgement, before turning back to his guests. Emily sat down at the edge of the stage for a moment, catching her breath as the sound of applause still echoed in her ears. She smiled softly, her tears finally falling, not from sadness but from relief. She had faced her greatest fear, stood against mockery, and turned it into triumph. That night, when she walked home under the quiet stars, she carried no money, no promises of fame, no guarantees that life would suddenly change. But she carried something far more precious. Proof that her voice mattered. Proof that even a waitress could silence a room full of the wealthy and powerful. Not with anger, but with song. And deep inside, she knew this was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning.